With me now is Elizabeth Goitein, who's a nationally recognized expert on presidential emergency powers. She's with the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a nonpartisan law and policy organization. Elizabeth, thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
As the Liberty and National Security Director, I want to ask you about the invocation of Title X, getting a lot of attention these days. We know it gives the president the authority to call up the National Guard, that is, in the case of a rebellion against the government. In your opinion, is the invocation of Title X necessary here in Portland?
No, it's not necessary. The facts on the ground in Portland simply do not sustain the use of what is in fact an emergency power. It can be used when there's a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. It can also be used when the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. Neither of those conditions are present. There have been protests in the last few weeks in Portland. Back in June, there were some incidents that resulted in some arrests. Misdemeanor charges were brought. But since June, these have been small and sedate, as they are characterized in Oregon's lawsuit, and certainly nothing that reaches the level where the president would have to take this draconian step that is ordinarily illegal in this country, which is to deploy the military for domestic law enforcement.
There are some in this city who will say that the local leaders haven't done enough to control what's happening down there at the ICE building, and thus they feel the National Guard or someone does need to come in to get things under control down there. What do you say to those folks?
Again, I think you have to look at the facts. There were some, as I said before, some incidents around the protests in June, and local law enforcement responded quickly and effectively. And for that reason, there have not been any incidents like that in the last few months. If people in Portland want to go down to the ICE facility and see for themselves, there just isn't anything approaching the level of chaos that's described in President Trump's memorandum, where he talks about, or I should say, I'm sorry, in his social media post, where he talks about, war-ravaged Portland and the ICE facilities being besieged. That simply doesn't match the facts on the ground, and it doesn't justify the use of these extraordinary legal authorities.
How often has Title X been invoked by presidents in the past?
So when you say Title X, Title X has a lot of different provisions in it. It includes both the Insurrection Act and the law that President Trump relied on in Los Angeles and is relying on in Oregon, which is 10 U.S.C. 12406. I wish it had a catchy title like the Insurrection Act. Unfortunately, it doesn't. But overall, presidents have deployed the military to quell civil unrest and to enforce the law roughly 30 times in our nation's 250-year history before this administration. And to put an even finer point on it, in the last 9 presidencies before Trump, there have been 2 deployments for these purposes, compared to what is now 5 deployments that have either happened or been authorized or requested by President Trump in just over 8 months in office. So this is something that has happened extremely rarely in the past, and that seems to be becoming almost a matter of routine under this presidency.
Can you give us some examples at all of when it has been utilized before this year?
Right. So generally, the uses fall into 2 categories. One is when state and local law enforcement are truly overwhelmed by mass violence or disorder, and the state asks for help. And that was the case in the last time that the Insurrection Act was invoked, which was in 1992. And that was when there were riots in Los Angeles after a jury acquitted police in the beating of Rodney King. And the governor of California in that case asked for the president to send troops. The other sort of category of cases is situations in which state and local law enforcement are either complicit in the violence in some ways. They are not protecting targets of violence, or they themselves are obstructing federal law. And those circumstances are probably best illustrated by the civil rights era, where presidents had to deploy troops to enforce civil rights law in situations where, either the state and local authorities were preventing desegregation of the schools, or they were failing to protect civil rights marchers and African Americans from targeted violence.
The state of Oregon has filed a temporary restraining order. What do they have to do to prove? What do they have to show here to get that TRO?
Sure. Well, they have to show a likelihood of success on the merits, or some likelihood of success on the merits. And they also have to show that there will be irreparable harm, and that the balance of harms tilts in favor of the court issuing a temporary restraining order in this case. Certainly in terms of the law, they are on very strong legal footing because, again, there is absolutely no indication here that the president is unable to execute federal law without federalizing the National Guard. And in terms of the harm, they've also made a very strong case that deployment of troops would actually make things worse, that it would inflame tensions and possibly create a civil disturbance that isn't actually happening right now.
If that TRO is denied, what recourse does the state have?
Well, the TRO is just the first stage of litigation. So if the TRO is denied, the state can move for a very quick hearing on a motion for a preliminary injunction. That's really the next step. The denial of a TRO would mean that the court doesn't think that the situation is so is so clearly illegal or creates such a harm, an immediate harm, that the court has to use this extraordinary remedy of a temporary restraining order. It would not mean that the court has found this conduct to be legal, and the court would then have an opportunity to take a little more time to make a decision on what it wants to do.
You mentioned Los Angeles. They had very similar issues, and a judge actually sided with California. How likely do you think that is to happen here?
I think that the facts in this case are even stronger for the plaintiffs, for the state of Oregon, than they were in the California case. And I thought the facts were pretty strong there too, but they are even stronger here. In California, there were some acts of violence that had been happening in the days leading up to the deployment of troops. Again, I don't think the evidence showed that those isolated actions actually made it impossible for the president to execute the law without using troops. But in Oregon, I think it's even more evident that there hasn't been the kind of interference that would even come close to justifying the use of the military.
We hear the National Guard troops will arrive in Portland sometime next week. They'll be under federal control. What are they allowed to do? Well,
that's another question that the courts may have to end up deciding. In Los Angeles, the Guard forces were authorized to do things like engage in temporary detentions and cursory searches of civilians. They were also conducting traffic control and crowd control, security functions. These are things that are squarely prohibited by the Posse Comitatus Act. That's a law that goes back to 1878, unless there is some statutory or express constitutional exception. And what a federal judge held in California fairly recently is that there is no exception to the Posse Comitatus Act when troops are deployed, as they were in Los Angeles, under this part of Title X. And that means that they cannot conduct any of these activities that are really the main activities they're being asked to perform. So that is going to be another pretty big legal hurdle for the administration if and when this reaches that point in the courts.
As you see how President Trump is utilizing Title X, what is his willingness to invoke this Title X tell you about his administration?
Again, we have seen the president using the military in American cities at a rate and in circumstances that are simply unprecedented. He seems to be routinizing the domestic use of the military for these law enforcement purposes. That goes completely against 250-year-old principle and tradition in this country. We heard him say at a gathering of 800 high-ranking generals and admirals who were called away from their posts to come listen to the president and Secretary Hegseth speak yesterday. And what we heard President Trump saying was that he told Secretary Hegseth that American cities should be the training grounds for the U.S. military. That is really a remarkable thing to say when you think about what the military is trained to do. The military, our military, greatest fighting force in the world. Soldiers are trained to fight and destroy an enemy. And President Trump wants them to practice this training in the streets of our cities. That is incredibly dangerous and raises all kinds of legal concerns.
One more question before I let you go, Elizabeth. As you watch all this unfold, what surprises you the most about the move to invoke Title 10 here?
Well, I think a lot of observers thought that President Trump might invoke the Insurrection Act. He had been talking about that for a while. We've heard him talk about that law many times, and seemed like that was something that he was inclined to do, and we haven't seen that happen yet. Instead, he's relying on this little-known law, 10 U.S.C. 12406, and it's not entirely clear, I think, why he's doing that. So I think that has come as a bit of a surprise. This is an untested law. Maybe that's the reason. And the courts are still trying to figure out when it can be applied and when it can't be applied. The other thing that I would say is surprising is just the rate at which he's doing this. He's not reserving it for situations where there might be some sort of plausible claim to an emergency. He's sort of dispensed with that, and he's invoking it in cities like Portland, where things are just clearly not at that level.
I'm sure you'll be watching everything unfold from where you are in the days and weeks to come here in Portland. Elizabeth Goitein, thank you for answering all of my questions. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.